So thank you for letting me speak with you today. I know some of you perhaps have heard of Hyperledger, perhaps think one thing or another about us. I thought I'd use this as a chance to kind of give you a sense of where we are as a community right now, some of the stuff that's been implemented, kind of where we are just in terms of adoption, but really just as an overview. There's a bunch of sessions coming up later today that dive into many of our specific projects and technologies. And I'll have a list of those at the very end. But this is intended just as kind of a half hour or less kind of update, and hope to leave some room for some Q&A afterward. So Hyperledger is a collaborative project at the Linux Foundation. We were formed as an effort to explore the use of blockchain technology for applications other than cryptocurrency. That seemed to be a pretty novel thing in 2015. And today, I'd argue that at least half of what goes on the show floor down there has been about the industrial application of distributed ledgers and smart contract systems to all sorts of different use cases. In those 3 years, we've seen a lot of growth, but it's been really built around this model that the Linux Foundation has pioneered. Sorry, that my monitor up here is out. So, and for those of you who don't know who the Linux Foundation is, the LF is about a 16-year-old organization that's been at the heart of the Linux ecosystem. Actually, starting about 10 years after Linus Torvalds first published his first draft of this Unix operating system kernel to a Usenet news group in 1991. 10 years after that, you started having all these companies, from Red Hat to IBM to SUSE to others building distributions of Linux and taking out Super Bowl ads and things like that. And there was a sense that there was a need for an organization that could sit at the heart of the developer ecosystem, make sure to answer the question of what happens if Linux is hit by a bus, but also how do you organize this kind of chaotic Brownian motion of developers and patches and activities and ideas and channel it in ways that larger companies can trust, right? That startups can take advantage of without feeling like they're at a disadvantage, right? That basically the world can build on top of rather than just becoming one single vendor kind of playground. And so that's been the role for the Linux Foundation historically, to facilitate both that developer ecosystem and the commercial ecosystem on top, help defend the brand of Linux, right? But also make sure it became truly a public resource that everyone could benefit from. And in the time since it launched, it's broadened quite a bit out from just focusing on this kernel of an operating system to open source projects in a large number of different fields. From cloud computing, you're probably all familiar with Kubernetes and Helm and other projects at the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. There's another project at the Linux Foundation called Automotive Grade Linux, which is about building an open source ecosystem amongst a bunch of the major car companies and their tier 1 and 2 suppliers in the world. And that has companies like Daimler and Toyota and others and hundreds of others involved in building a common open source layer for the automotive software, from diagnostics to travel to all those sorts of things. All the way to Linux Foundation Networking, which is a collection of utilities and software-defined networking tools that telcos use to manage their networks. Something like 75% of the world's mobile phone subscribers basically consume services produced by open source software being run by China Mobile, by AT&T, by all these other companies, who also in turn contribute in. I mean, that's kind of the secret sauce of this, is how do we get the companies who are realizing benefit from these technologies to also play a role in feeding back. And so just like these other kind of projects that are part of the Linux Foundation, Hyperledger is kind of a focus on, again, distributed ledgers and smart contract systems. And it also is this kind of umbrella organization for a number of individual software components. And rather than taking the perspective of saying, there'll be one single chain or one single ledger, a single infrastructure, the kind of formative kind of realization was that a better way to bootstrap these networks is likely to allow them to spin up independently and then figure out how to weave them together over time. And that what was most important out there was trying to find a way to come up with common software pieces that make it easy to launch these networks. Now there might be different types of networks that necessitate different types of software, just like there's different types of databases in the world. We aren't all converging on a single, database like Postgres or something like that. And so there's probably a need for some optionality and some choice. But let's see if we can come up with kind of an optimal set and build a portfolio of different technologies. And that's really what Hyperledger is about. We have, actually, this slide is now dated as of last week. We have 2 more projects to add to this, and I'll cover one of them as we go on. But we have 14 different projects now within the Hyperledger greenhouse. And these technologies are at various states of maturity. Some of them are still pretty young and still only have a few developers working on them. Others are now being used in hundreds of different production deployment networks and generating tremendous amounts of value for their end users. With each project, what we bring kind of as a standardized template is a set of tools. Those tools are common to any other open source project you might be familiar with, not only the free stuff out there like GitHub, obviously, as well as something called Garrett, which is kind of a self-hosted Git instance that we use for some of the projects, to Jira and a chat system called Rocket Chat. I'll show you an example of that. To a common open source license across all of these different projects. We really believe in the Apache license. It's something I have some personal history with, so I believe in it personally too. It turns out the Apache license is the one that you can put in front of any corporate lawyer, and I've never seen a negative response to it, right? This is a license that says, do what you want with this code. You don't owe us a thing. Just don't blame us when it breaks, but feel free to incorporate it inside your own commercial products and services. And that, that creates this kind of, I think, a sense of goodwill. It also brings down any barriers to companies using this code. And because all of those projects are under the same license, it means when one project comes up with a cool idea, it can be copied over by another project. And there's this kind of reuse, and good ideas can be rivalrous, but also additive to each other at the same time. Another thing that we do is ensure that when projects come in, that like the history of where that code contribution comes from is very clear. So we ask for developers to create a certificate of origin that says, this code is something I own the rights to or have the authority to be able to contribute in. And that history is actually really important to being able to show that history provably in the commit logs is really important to enterprises feeling comfortable using this code and incorporating it into their own products. So in addition to these kind of tools and processes, we also really around each project aim to build this pool of developer volunteers. Now, you can call them volunteers, but the presumption is not that everybody is there out of pure charity. The presumption is actually that all the developers are there solving a problem for themselves, for their employers. In some cases, it's because they want to improve their resume or they want to improve their skills, but most of the time it's going to be because their employer, their job is depending upon this code and they want to improve it. And we believe very strongly that you can't manage the roadmaps for these different projects top down. It has to be bottoms up. It has to come from the developers themselves and what they want to build. There's that line, history is made by those who show up. And so if you were looking at our product suite as if we were a traditional enterprise company, it would be very bizarre because there's, I'll flip back and I'll go into depth into some of these, but there's names used for these projects that are kind of like inside jokes and confusing. There are a couple of these that compete with each other, actually, and I'll go into some more detail in a bit. So again, top down, it doesn't make much sense. Bottoms up, it's very much this living, breathing ecosystem of different projects that at the end of the day, we believe is an effective way to cover the solution space. And then there's a funded core Linux staff consisting of about 9 full-time people, myself included. And there's roughly saying 2 things that we do. One is something called community architecture. I've got a staff of 3 people who are focused on kind of performing that air traffic control function. How do we make sure that when a developer shows up, every hour that they might spend results in as much productivity as possible, right? That they're happy with what they've done and it contributes to the whole. And whether that's watching how the tools are used or doing some training, setting up some processes, that sort of thing. We also try to make sure that the vendor community that we're building around this, the ones that actually support us in our work, because we're a member-funded, kind of membership fees-funded organization, make sure they get some value. And that's performed by the ecosystem directors on the team. Again, another group of about 4 people that we have. And so let me dive in now on a couple of specifics on the different projects and give kind of an update on them. Again, there'll be more information shared and some talks later this afternoon on the other side of this hall. You could call it the granddaddy of our projects is Hyperledger Fabric. It was a project that this, along with the next one, Sawtooth, were the ones the project launched with at the beginning of 2016. Fabric is now, it hit a release 1.4.1 about a month and a half ago, and at the same time, the development community put out an alpha for version 2. It has a super modular architecture when it comes to the consensus mechanisms and what are called membership services. These are ways that basically nodes get badged into the permission system. It's intended to be essentially an operating system for building blockchain networks. In 2.0, which is aiming for production release later this year, there's better lifecycle support for what's called chain code, which is really the smart contract functionality that's in the system. Something called Raft consensus, which is a more decentralized way to do the consensus mechanisms to put the next entries in the ledger, as well as UTXO support, so that there's better support for non-fungible tokens. For fungible tokens. There's already great support for non-fungible tokens for being able to say, use it as an asset tracking system for property, for digital assets of all sort. But when you want to be able to, spend tokens and get back fractions of them and that sort of thing, something like UTXO, which Bitcoin has had forever, is a much better way to do it. And better Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanisms are also on the way. There have been over 200 different developers across 100 different companies that have contributed to the development of Fabric. There's also been hundreds of different pilot and production networks deployed out there. In fact, Fabric is now available on all the major cloud providers, not only AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, and the vendor-specific ones as well, IBM, SAP, Oracle. All of them have not just white box service. Sure, take a system image and run it on in a VM or something like that, but actual managed blockchain services where staff at AWS and Google and IBM obviously are inside optimizing, speed tuning, making it perform well, giving you an SLA, that sort of thing. But also now across the major China clouds as well. So Baidu, Tencent, Ali, and Huawei, all who run services very much like AWS and IBM blockchain. It's really a global effort. In fact, about 20% of the companies that are a part of our community, and I'd say about 10% of the IP contributions, come from China. And that's really been important for us because, a lot of the deployments of blockchain technology are global in nature, are about supply chains that not only involve, factories in China, but might involve raw materials from Africa, right? So making sure that you're building these networks that can truly cross borders has been really important to us. Hyperledger Sawtooth has been the second project that has come out of out of Hyperledger. It started life kind of with a very distinctive approach to consensus mechanisms, implementing something called proof of elapsed time, which is a Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanism that allows for kind of a random leader election based on using features in Intel's SGX extensions to do that securely. And so it is probably a better approach when you want to have hundreds or thousands of nodes on a network, or lots and lots of small devices as nodes on your network. And so, and none of these, by the way, use proof of work. All of these are essentially, you could think of it as proof of authority, proof of stake. It's basically one node, one vote in many of these consensus mechanisms. So none of the energy consumption that you have from proof of work. But Sawtooth has also proven to be a platform for experimenting with other kind of advanced functionality. It was the first one to support running Ethereum smart contracts on top of itself. Fabric now has support for that as well. And so there's some longer term thinking going on in Sawtooth that's really exciting and is a nice complement to Fabric. Now, none of us can stand here and tell you, what is one better for the other from a use case point of view, any more so than I could tell you whether your shopping cart app should use Postgres or MongoDB. It's kind of up to you as an architect to kind of get to know how these tools work and understand more deeply how they play with, how they compare to each other. But that's kind of the fun of digging around in these tools. Another project that's much more distinctive from those two is Hyperledger Indy. Indy is a distributed ledger designed for building self-sovereign or user-centric digital ID systems. It is a set of libraries and tools, but it is actually a running code that is used as the underpinning behind a couple of different networks out there, including the Sovereign Foundations network. So there'll be a couple of talks here at Consensus on this organization, SOVRIN. They're building a kind of a backbone to building a decentralized digital identity networks, utilizing zero-knowledge proofs as a way to prove credentials that are true about you in other contexts without creating what's called the super cookie problem, where if you have one ID, it becomes like your social security number. You don't want everybody having that one ID, but using zero-knowledge proofs and a lot of other privacy by design approaches, you can get to a point where you might ask for somebody's, say, if you want to badge them into to sell them alcohol online and you want to make sure they're 21 and over, you don't necessarily care about seeing their driver's license. You just want to know if they're over the age of 21. And so this concept of verifiable claims, concepts around managing of personal information, things that are very GDPR compliant, approaches that are very GDPR compliant, that's what Indy is all about. There's some really interesting deployments coming up as well that I'll tell you about in a bit. Another really active project inside Hyperledger is Hyperledger Burrow. So for the longest time, we've had a pretty good relationship with the Ethereum community. There's very clearly interesting technology coming out of a lot of the work that's going on there. The most distinctive thing is the smart contract approach that Ethereum is taking. And so there's a project that came in about a year and a half ago called Burrow, which is an implementation of an Ethereum virtual machine, basically an interpreter for Ethereum bytecode. It came in as a project that could run standalone on top of Tendermint as the consensus mechanism, but now it has also been ported over to both Sawtooth and Fabric. In fact, Shweta, who's sitting in the back there, did a lot of the work on porting it over to Fabric, and I think you're talking later today, right? Tomorrow, talking tomorrow. Okay, about this. So be sure and check that out because it's a fun story. Another recent graduate to production release is Hyperledger Iroha. Now, Iroha was kind of this wild card for us. There's this team in Japan, a company called Soramitsu, who had written this really lightweight, really simple, stripped down, really focused just on digital assets blockchain system, using, again, a novel consensus mechanism that was truly Byzantine fault tolerant, written in C++, designed to run in very small and low resourced environments with a bunch of great mobile app support. So, as well as an interesting approach to doing multi-sig transactions. They now have hit 1.0 release. There's some interesting deployments with a national bank in Asia, a central bank in Asia that they're working with, and a team that's spread across Japan and Russia, actually, with obviously contributions from a lot of other places. Again, a bit of a wild card, a bit of something cool and potentially worth checking out, but again, an example of us building this portfolio of different ledger applications. We've also added a couple of projects in the last few months that are probably worth noting. One is Hyperledger Ursa. So we started to find that there was interest in supporting advanced hashing routines and zero-knowledge proofs across many different Hyperledger projects. So we said, cryptography is one of those things you really don't and really shouldn't roll your own, right? There shouldn't be n different implementations. There should be, and there should be a good way to get a lot of eyeballs on the same body of code. So we said, why don't we follow the best tradition of projects like OpenSSL and other cryptography libraries and kind of pull them together into one place and see if we can get more attention focused on that, perhaps even certification along certain national standards. And so Hyperledger Ursa is simply a library of cryptographic routines that we hope makes it easier to adopt these concepts in not only the other Hyperledger projects, but potentially beyond. In fact, a couple of the maintainers on Ursa are working for Dfinity. And so the use of this technology by the public ledger applications out there is something we'd love to see. It would hopefully be helpful to many of the other projects there. Hyperledger Grid is another very different type of project. This came in from a collaboration between a company named Cargill, who is a very large agricultural conglomerate agricultural technology company, who found themselves building a lot of supply chain types of services on top of Sawtooth. So they took the demo code for building the supply chain and kind of extended it. It became its own kind of animal. Other companies started to get involved, a startup company called Bitwise, and it made sense to kind of launch it as its own project. Now, we're not really interested in doing like full end user applications at Hyperledger. We kind of want to stay in the building blocks and frameworks and tools kind of like place. Like we wouldn't want, say, a healthcare record system where 1% of that was about blockchain technology, the other 99% was about healthcare specific stuff. But things like Grid, where we take these collections of use cases and kind of come up with a regular templatized way to do it, is very interesting to us. So kind of going up the stack, if you will, from framework. And then a new project that doesn't have a logo yet, called Hyperledger Aries, is one that we are announcing today. Aries is infrastructure for blockchain-rooted peer-to-peer interactions. Basically, when you have clients that talk to blockchain networks, particularly around identity, but potentially in the long term around other types of digital assets, you need a way for them to be able to exchange exchange information point to point, using the blockchain as a kind of a reference point for that, a way to verify the integrity of those exchanges, maybe eventually record those exchanges, but to do a lot of that off-chain, off-ledger. So this is a toolkit for doing that in a standardized way that also handles the local storage and ensuring that's done securely as well. There are today, obviously, thousands of wallets. There will always be thousands of wallets out there, it seems, even though we've gotten down to 2 or 3 web browsers. But you want to make sure at least those thousands of wallets are competently coded, are adopting standards, and the idea is that this is technology that makes that easier to do. A key point I want to reinforce is that Hyperledger as an open source community is 100% dedicated to being open, right? And really living and breathing that. There's no pay-to-play kind of side to what Hyperledger does. We do have a membership structure. The members, we give benefits around certain events that we do, certain marketing kinds of activities. But when it comes to the development of the code, there's no barrier to participation. There's no preference that's given to somebody who's a member or not. You could be a 15-year-old kid sitting in Bucharest or Beijing or Bangalore, and if you had clear communication skills, if you were technically proficient, you should be able to become a core developer on any of these projects, right? Or if you're a large company or a startup company, you can use this code, you can contribute to it, you can make it a core part of what you do. You don't owe us a dime. We're playing a numbers game here. Our hope is that with millions of users, millions of companies involved, we get just enough who are willing to contribute to the core. And also that in the long term, any of these projects, as they grow and are successful, you can rest assured that they're not dependent on a single vendor. Because vendors come and go, companies come and go, they get interested in things and then move on. But we want to make sure if you've built on top of any of these packages, you're not left stranded when something like that happens. And we're also really driven by a duocracy. Again, some of this doesn't make sense if I were a large company presenting a top-down product roadmap or product strategy. We're not ICO funded. We're not funded by a large, $1 billion million foundation or grant or anything like that. Everything happens from the developers showing up and making things work. And I've tried to avoid the term meritocracy because that sometimes gets a bit polluted. But we are really driven by a do-ocracy. If there are things that are missing, it's only because someone hasn't shown up yet to help us work on those. To give just a really quick tour of some of the development tools that we use, very core to what we do, obviously, is code on GitHub, but is also a wiki. And now it might sound kind of retro to the point of almost like I'm talking about 8-track cassettes or something like that to be talking about how cool wikis are, but it is kind of the lifeblood of our community. Being able to keep track of what we're working on, what people have written, who's working on what is core to being able to be an effective decentralized development community. And so the wiki is really core to that, wiki.hyperledger.org. Chat is also really core to that. So I know people love to talk about how many members they have in their Telegram channel as if that's a meaningful metric. It's kind of not. But chat is an essential feature of building these developer communities. And so we use an open source Slack equivalent called Rocket Chat, which, unlike Slack, allows us to keep a full history of the conversations. So you should be able to go back and discover 3 years ago why was a certain architectural decision made in Fabric by searching Slack and some of the other resources we have. And then we also have a lot of phone calls, a lot of verbal communication. This is something that, I'm more of an old school email kind of guy, and I keep coming back to the community going, we should be talking over email more. But people really like the immediacy of voice. They like the way it humanizes a lot of the development approach and the way it kind of creates a time pressure to get something done. So all of our calls are open. Many of them are recorded and minuted. We believe that's pretty essential to ensuring that those calls don't become kind of a backdoor for private decisions to be made that aren't transparent or participatory. So how widely is this stuff being used, and what are some interesting deployments? You all probably saw the Forbes Blockchain 50 article that came out, which ended up looking pretty good for us. There were 23 of the 50, 23 direct mentions of Hyperledger Fabric. But when you add up the use of IBM blockchain, which is all Hyperledger Fabric, when you add the mention of DTCC, Rob, I noticed it only mentioned Axe-Core. It didn't mention some of the stuff on Fabric you guys are doing too. That's Rob Palatnik, who's the chairman of my board over there, sitting in the corner with I was with DTCC. Google Cloud also supports it, which also wasn't mentioned, as well as the mention of Oracle Blockchain and Samsung NextLedger, which are also based on Fabric, gives us 32 out of the 50. Blockchain 50 using Hyperledger Fabric. And to their credit, the public, I'm pretty sure that was public when it mentioned Ethereum in that list, being used for 21 of those 50, 13 for Corda, 12 for Quorum. But it was also really gratifying to see of those 50, 3 with Hyperledger Indy and 3 with Hyperledger Sawtooth. These aren't just kind of also-rans. These are tools that are being used in production by large companies. So that's really cool to see, and I'm sure we'll see more Hyperledger projects over time. Don't want to bore you with too many use cases. I know most of you are here for the developer information and development activity, but I want to get across that these are tools that are being used by real companies to solve real problems. Whether it's the food trust network that Walmart and IBM and a number of other companies are engaged in, and it's a lot of the larger retail kind of food companies as well getting on that system. Projects like Circular, which is a company that has built a blockchain network to track tantalum and other rare earth minerals coming out of Africa to make sure that they are coming from certified mines and not mines that deploy slave labor, to companies like ScanTrust, which are using this to build supply chain traceability solutions that follow these QR codes that can't be copied because they've got the actual kind of threads in the UPC code or in the QR code form a part of that signal. So if you copy that, the threads differ. It's really a cool idea. So lots of these kind of core activities going on. Wanted to also mention really quickly, with Hyperledger Indy, there's a couple of cool projects. One being run by the government of British Columbia to use it for digital identity for businesses rather than for citizens. But they've registered now 6 million, issued IDs to 6 million different businesses that use now essentially a wallet to manage all of their certifications and permits and other things that they get from the government of British Columbia. In the long term, the vision is using the individual or the business owner with the wallet as the pivot point for engaging it with digital government, rather than waiting for governments to integrate their digital systems together. And so a radically different way to do GovTech than how it's been done for the last 10 years, which is waiting for government to integrate all their systems together, but something that should cut a lot of red tape and be a more agile way for government systems to be built. Similarly, there's a project being done by Kiva, who are one of the first peer-to-peer lending organizations out there in the world. They kind of pioneered that model about 15 years ago. They're working with the government of Sierra Leone and a UN agency and a group at the World Bank to implement both a national digital ID system for the people of Sierra Leone, along with a credit history system that is privacy-based, is self-sovereign based, and this is to try to cut the cost of lending in a country that has no credit history system. And they're using a combination of Indy and Fabric to do this. As I mentioned, we're a truly global community. We've got active meetup communities in over 160 different cities in 65 different countries. I spend a lot of time on planes, as does my staff, but really it's the local leadership that we see in India and Brazil, all over Europe, all over the US that really makes this the community that it can be. We've also started to do these boot camps. We had one a few weeks ago in Hong Kong with 150 people that really is designed to help people across the learning curve when it comes not only to using the technologies, but becoming a part of the community, fixing bugs, adding features, understanding how that contributor flow works. We have a very active internship program. Sorry, I tried to squeeze a lot into 30 minutes, so I can't spend much more time. But the only place where we actually spend money on getting code written ourselves from the Hyperledger community is on this internship program. This year we'll fund 15 of these $5,000 internship programs, interns, for which we're always seeking additional mentors and guides to help with that. Lots and lots of working groups that cut across the different projects on concepts like architecture and identity, on performance and scalability, to try to make sure that these projects really behave like a portfolio, as well as special interest groups that we use to engage with industries at different levels, healthcare, trade finance, and we just launched one this week on supply chain. And this is really a way for us to go above the level of the code and start to say, are we actually solving real problems out there? Are we able to talk about how to use these building blocks in a way that can serve actual end user interests? And part of the validation of that is we don't just have one or two companies now offering products and support. There's 85 different companies in our community offering commercial services on top of different Hyperledger code. So there's a lot of other places you'll be able to hear more about, specifically more about the technology, about the different projects. Later today, starting at 10:30, there's a guided tour of Hyperledger Fabric with, actually, I'm sorry, I guess I have the date wrong on that. Is that tomorrow, Shweta? Tomorrow at 10:30? Or do you remember the time? Okay, so sorry, so that's Wednesday at 10:30 with Shweta and with Drummond, who's also here, talking about Fabric and Hyperledger Indy. But again, later today at 3:30, there's a series of 4 talks happening just across the hall on Ursa, on Iroha, on Burrow, and on Caliper, which is our performance and benchmarking tool. And then tomorrow night, there's a meetup happening over at 90 Park Avenue of the Hyperledger New York City community. So lots happening. It's really great to be here with so many of our community members, and there's just a tremendous amount of momentum now. 3 years into this open source project, we're really hitting our stride. So it's really good to see. I know I'm way over time, but I'll be happy to answer some questions off the stage. Thank you so much.